Hello, everyone. My name is Darling Nisi, and I'm here to moderate your panel for the 30th anniversary of the Pandemonium album. We have my panel here today, and I'll let them introduce themselves, and we'll start with Mr. Zachary Hoskins.
Okay, I'm Zachary Hoskins, and I am the writer of the Dance Music Sex Romance blog and podcast.
Okay, Ricky?
I'm Rick Wyatt, bass player, podcast guest for Grown Folks Music.
And I am Ivan Orr. I'm the music editor for Grown Folks Music, as well as one of the cohorts on the Prince and Prince-related podcast for GFM.
Awesome. I'm very excited to facilitate all these men. Okay, so what I love about the panelists that we have today, as you heard, they do their own podcasts, and a lot of them actually do their own media for music that's outside of Prince. Zachary Hoskins runs the Dystopian Dance Party blog with his sister Callie, and they talk about funk, and they do their Jerry Curl June thing usually. And maybe not this year, but we'll see, maybe other times. And then, of course, Ricky and Ivan have Grown Folks Music podcast, and they have this huge media conglomerate of talking about all types of music. And I think that's really important when we're talking about Prince or Prince-affiliated music as well, because it kind of places it in context of what was going on at the time, and they have all that knowledge they can bring to put that context there. So what I want to talk about first is that context. So we talked about yesterday and today, talking about New Jack Swing, all the genres and trends that were happening in the late 80s. So I want to ask you guys, how do you think that this project, Graffiti Bridge and Pandemonium, fit in the time of music and what was going on at that time?
Wow. Anyone who wants to take that one first?
Well, let's see. 1990. I think Public Enemy had Fear of a Black Planet. I think Anita Baker had done compositions. The summer jam of that summer was like Snap, I Got the Power.
Yep.
Or like CNC Music Factory. Hammer was You Can't Touch This. That was his summer. So it was an interesting, I know for me in R&B music, there were the only band that had come out that year was like Tony. They had just come out that summer with their second album. I know Revival with It Never Rains and all of that stuff was on there. So I was kind of looking forward to it. You know, with Prince's thing, I think he, you know, I think Graffiti Bridge came out later during that fall. And so I think some of it was, you know, like typical, you know, Prince doing his thing in terms of like joy and repetition, like The Question of You, you know, those things kind of stood out. And then there were some things where you could kind of tell he, like, I guess Stevie Wonder did, you know, kind of got lost in like the technology with the drum machines and some things. And it was kind of like, it sounds, I won't say New Jack Swingish, but it sounds like, okay, I'm going to do my version of this. And it kind of was like, you know, give us what you would give, you know, not give us what you were giving us in the 80s, but give us that like creativeness of pushing something forward instead of trying to adjust to in the 90s, you know, with some things. But, and, you know, I thought Thieves in the Temple was great. Like that was a great sounding tune. So, you know, that's one of his best studio tunes that, you know, he has. I don't think he ever did a better live version than he did a studio version of that song. So, you know, but I thought the Pandemonium thing, I thought it was, you know, in terms of I thought at that time, it came out of left field, honestly, because I did not know they were going to be doing that. You know, it's not like now where you get stuff online and you get all these things. It was just, you walked in the record store one day and saw future releases and saw the time Pandemonium. and that's how you found out. You was like, oh wow, okay, you know. And then you waited for them to, you know, do like the video shows and the TV shows, you know, like Arsenio and all of that. And it was cool. I thought it was great.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things about New Jack Swing. New Jack Swing has come up through this conference. Graffiti Bridge was sort of like phase one for Prince trying to do New Jack Swing. And I think it's an interesting, as a Prince fan, it's an interesting place to hear Prince trying to do something that somebody else originated, you know, because we usually think of him as an innovator. I mean, I do think, some of his early 80s stuff was like a synthesis of, post-disco R&B and new wave, synth pop. So like, it's not that he had never incorporated a trend before, but I feel like rap, New Jack Swing were the first things that he kind of had to catch up with a little bit, and he wasn't ahead of the curve. But so, I mean, it's interesting to hear Graffiti Bridge in that context of Prince, kind of trying to figure out a trend that he didn't come up with. It's also interesting for Pandemonium, because this is the first time that we've heard Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis actually on a time record. And Jam and Lewis were really one of the originators of New Jack Swing. So it's this interesting confluence, or at least like progenitors, I guess I should say, like with Control by Janet Jackson. So it's this interesting confluence of like, Jam and Lewis, who had struck out on their own and were innovating in some ways, had kind of almost outgrown the Prince stable that they started out in, and Prince, who was, trying to maintain relevance for the first time in his career.
Yeah, I just to piggyback a little bit, the whole idea of relevance really speaks to me, because 1990, you really get to the point where the youth movement, especially when you talk about R&B music, hip hop, the youth movement is in full swing. So, the last time we hear from the time, we're kind of in the middle of, it's still the kind of leftover 70s, and you still have bands, you still have artists that are making more adult sounding music. But by the time you get to the summer of 90, I mean, it's. And so, the whole notion of trying to play catch up, the whole notion of just wrestling with, for the first, maybe the first time, like, man, I'm not necessarily on the cutting edge. I'm not necessarily leading a trend. So how do we deal with this? And then of course, when you're such a prolific composer and you have the skill set to do whatever, a lot of times you're not the person who's going to turn to someone and say, hey, I may have the chord structure, I may have the bass line, but I'm not really hip on the beats. So, so when you don't have that, sometimes it can kind of, come across like, yeah, that's kind of it, but, it might not be.
Yeah, Prince is not going to have Teddy Riley co-produce Pandemonium. If anyone, he'll have Kirk Johnson do it a couple of years down the line. That's its own conversation.
Okay, so the next question I have for you guys is a little bit more about the context as far as how you experienced it. Zach and I are a little bit younger, so we were like 5 or 6 years old when this album came out. But for those of you who experienced, you got it day one, what was that like? What do you remember hearing about it? How was it promoted? Things like that.
To put it in context for you, imagine you're like 9 or 10. You see this band on TV, because there was, and they aren't wearing like futuristic suits. They aren't, but that was the thing of the day. They're wearing like, just regular suit and tie clothes, kind of like, like young adults in, say, your neighborhood. About a year later, the Triple Threat Tour comes along, but you can't go because you're like 12. Like 11 or 12. And this is...
I went as a 12-year-old.
Nice.
Yeah. She had a chaperone. But, in terms of the African-American, community, this was like a year or two after like the Atlanta child murder. So parents weren't too keen on letting their children just go out.
Oh, wow.
Out. And so the tour comes, then you miss it. Then another year or two later, like Purple Rain comes, it's a secret that they're kind of in the movie. You find out they're in the movie, they do a great job, and then you find out they broke up.
Right.
And it's kind of like, dang.
Yeah, so they were zombies in Purple Rain. There wasn't even the time.
Right.
Yeah. So then from like 84 till July 1990, you get these like reminders of what could be. You get 3 Jesse Johnson records. You get 2 Morris Day records. You get Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis doing a Janet record 3 Sherelle albums, 2 like Alexander O'Neal records, and a Christmas album. And so you always, like, whenever you see them, it's always the byline of X time guitar player, X time band member. And they, like, they're sharing these stories about like when they were together, when they were on tour. And this was before YouTube, so like you couldn't see past footage or anything. And then one night in 1987, when they go to Flight Time on Video Soul, you get this clip at the end of where they do like a reunion at the Minneapolis Music Awards. And you're like, great, it's going to happen. And it's like November 1987. And you're like waiting and waiting and waiting. And then July 1990 comes and it's like, they're back. And then like Ivan said, like, times have changed, but I think people who were fans still were like, yay, they're back. Like, I'm going to get it. And, regardless of what the pulse of young people were, like you figure a kid who was 13 in 1984 is 1920, 1990. So they aren't that far like removed from, their fandom. And so liking them was still, kind of a thing. I knew I was there the day it came out. I was like, I think one of the first ones, I got there and got it. And I was just overjoyed. I'm not gonna lie. I was overwhelmed because they've always been my favorite band. So, I was ecstatic. Ivan, what about you?
One word, Arsenio.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like just the importance of what those performances meant, and especially for a group like that, because it's like how you described it. I'm of an age where it wasn't necessarily, well, it was me, but it was me through my older sister who had got me into the time, and of course I wasn't old enough to go to the Triple Threat, but yeah, I wasn't. But it's just that anticipation.
Yeah.
And then for finally to like you say, you kind of heard, and then then the other part is it's just like receiving it, because now you've got a band full of they always were great, but now they've done all this stuff and they're coming back together.
Yeah,
man, come on. I'm there. Yeah.
I mean, like you got glimpses, like when Jam and Lewis did the Janet Control video.
Mm-hmm.
And when they did the Grammy like performance, you got these glimpses, like when they did the Fishnet video, like with Morris, you were like, okay, it's kind of happening. It just didn't happen fast enough. Mm-hmm. I know for some of us. Then it came on. Yeah, it was cool.
Yeah, Zach.
Okay, so Zach, I know that you covered some songs from this album on the Dystopian Dance Party a couple of years ago. So you had some awareness of it, but what made you kind of go back to listen to it and discover this album?
Yeah, I mean, it was for me just like getting into Prince, and then beyond that, whoa, I'm getting some.
Do you have two windows open? If you have two windows open, you're going to get that feedback.
I do not. Does anybody else?
No,
I don't hear it right now.
No,
okay.
You're good.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, it was getting into Prince and then getting into the time as like a corollary to that. I can't remember exactly when I actually sat down and listened to Pandemonium, but I was definitely aware of Jerk Out, and that was like, was always the standout track for me. And then I heard Chocolate, the bootleg version, the Prince version. So I was more familiar with the quote unquote original Chocolate than I was with the Times remake. So hearing it finally, like catching up and hearing it, it was wild because it's, almost the same song. And then they're doing these things like taking, they take Prince's ad lib with the mashed potatoes, gravy, green beans, and they're like cutting it up into a skit that's like a dialogue between him and Morris. It's pretty inventive, and so it was interesting to hear, and also interesting just that those songs were old by the time. I mean, Prince was raiding the vault for Graffiti Bridge, and he was also doing it for Pandemonium. Obviously, coming at it from like retrospectively, I was much more aware of that than I think people were in 1990. But it's interesting because Jerk Out was recorded in 82, but it doesn't sound like it. It sounds fresh, I think, or it would have sounded fresh in 1990.
Yeah. Now that was one of the things I kind of wrestled with like years later, because I was like, man, like this song was done in 82, but you had, like producers of the year in Jam and Lewis in this band. You got Jesse Johnson, who had done like Free World and Tamara Nassim, and like Monty Moore did like Pleasure Principle, and and Jelly Bean Johnson did like Why Should I Cry, and then you give them Jerk Out, it's almost like, you mean like they couldn't come up with some. I'm sure they could have came up with something, like to kind of rival that or challenge that, or maybe stronger. But I enjoyed Jerk Out though. I just like Zach says, and when you find out that it's like an older song, it kind of steals some of the lackluster from like, oh.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna say I apologize if Jam and Lewis are watching this. I'm just gonna say I don't think they really brought their A game to this album. There are Jam and Lewis tracks, like I think Pandemonium is them.
Mm-hmm.
The title track Pandemonium is them, and
yes, them and Jesse.
It feels to me like they were waiting for Rhythm Nation to for their best stuff. It feels like there was a little bit of their B material on Pandemonium. That's just me.
Well, I think in the context of everything, I think if you look at it, it's 5 Prince songs on there and it's 5 band songs.
Mm-hmm.
And so they can possibly share like Summertime Thing, because they all played on that in the studio, like when it was done. So it's kind of like, given what the commentary was on the film last night, you kind of wonder if they were rushed, if they had time to do more, if say, it was kind of like, well, who has something ready? And it was like, okay, you got something ready, good, here, let's take that, and so on. So, but the 5 songs that they did, Pandemonium, Blondie, Skillet, It's Your World, Sometimes I Get Lonely, those are pretty, strong tunes. So.
Okay. So I know we talked a little bit about the context of Pandemonium coming out. Did you realize, I have to ask you because, it's 5. Did you guys realize that it was connected to Graffiti Bridge, or that they were sister projects at all? Or did they seem like they were kind of separate?
I think at the time it came out, because it kind of was like word was leaking that like Graffiti Bridge was coming out, and at the time was in it. But the Pandemonium album, when you bought it, it never said, songs in this film or anything just like that. It was just an album on its own.
Mm-hmm.
When they were doing their press spots, like on Video Soul on BET, like Arsenio and things like that, they would mention the movie, but it was more so about them getting back together. Because see, the biggest thing about it was them getting back together, because it had been such a long wait and people were so hyped to see it. And so like that's what their like discussions were around. They kind of mentioned like Graffiti Bridge, but that was about it. Like it was kind of like, oh yeah, it's coming out later this fall or something like that, but it wasn't too in depth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I too just thought of it as in terms of, wow, they're back. And I was hopeful that, it would be longer than, what ended up happening, but I totally understand. Yeah. But I think part of for myself being, I was 20 years old. And as Rick mentioned early on, there was a pruning in the music industry to that point where it was like black bands that turned into dinosaurs. And my background is, coming from playing in bands and even playing in bands at that age. And it was almost like, okay, we got the Tonys, and now here comes the time back. Maybe we're starting a trend here. Of course, it didn't really happen, but we did get Mint Condition a year later. So
yeah, we did.
So
it kind of makes me think about, again, I'm thinking about Celebration, and they talked about, typical, or not typical, potential sequels to Purple Rain. And somebody mentioned that one of them was The Time was going to own a club in Vegas, and Prince wouldn't be in it at all. And I'm just thinking about, I wonder how far down the line they got with that, because that would make Pandemonium make a little bit more sense, or even Corporate World, when they're developing an idea like that. And then here's the album to go with it, especially with as much Prince wasn't as centered on it, and he kind of let them, do their thing a little bit with this album. So that said, talking about Corporate World, we know that this had started, between Prince and Morris, and they were messing around, and it became an album that eventually came into be Pandemonium. Do you guys know anything about? I know you just said they kind of went away and then they came back, but were there any rumblings about that, or is it all post, all of this coming out? And what did you think when you found out Corporate World was in progress later, and then it developed into this? Any thoughts about that?
I didn't, to be honest with you, I didn't hear about Corporate World until years later, when the internet kind of came up and people were having Prince fan sites, and they were saying there was a 1989 Time album. And then when they showed the songs, by that point, I had a few bootlegs with some of those songs on it. Plus, some of them had been released. Like, I think like Murph Drag was on there. Corporate World, I think Shake and Love Machine and all those things, like Release It, like those were like Corporate World tracks. I don't know if Jerk Out and Chocolate were. I would imagine that they were. Maybe Donald Trump Black Version was maybe one. I'm not remembering, but yeah, at that time there was no rumblings like they were doing an album prior to and then they stopped. It just wasn't until years later, when the bootleg circuit kind of took off, that you got these little, like other songs from it, and you're like, oh, so this is from that project, stuff like that.
Okay. Any other thoughts about that one?
No, I think Rick. No. Rick summed it up. No.
Okay, Zach,
I wanted to highlight Murph Drag. That did kind of get an official release with the NPG Music Club later, but if you haven't checked that out, Google, because it deserves all the accolades. That's just my personal. That was a note that I wrote. Okay.
And it's interesting, if you're like a Princeologist or whatever, you hear like they use Murph part of the chant for Murph Drag. They use it in Pandemonium. So I always think it's cool to find those connections.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about the album itself now. It's, as we've kind of talked about, it's one that doesn't get talked about a lot among the Times discography. People know about it, or the people might have heard about it, but it's not one people go to revisit, which should, and I hope our discussion today encourages people to go do that. But again, this is the time where Prince allowed people to have control over some of the things. You heard Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis produced some of these songs and wrote some of these songs. And even looking at some of the ASCAP information, though Prince's songs aren't on ASCAP, if you look at the ones where he contributed to, you can see how it's broken out as far as the songwriter credits and stuff. And there are quite a few songs from this album where this happened. So before we get to the songs, why do you think that Prince was more open to kind of relinquishing some of that control and bringing in more of the band to be able to play and contribute to this album?
Oh, he didn't have a choice. He didn't have a choice. I mean, Jam and Lewis were like producers of the year. Like they had some success. Jesse had some success. So for it to work, he kind of had to like recognize that they had left him and had hits without him helping them have hits. And so, one thing you can check from Prince is, he's old school. He kind of respected you if you did it, or if you could do it like yourself. And so, I think, once he, like maybe when they left, he probably thought, they won't make it. And then when they made it, he was kind of like, oh, wow. So, I think Jesse has said, he told a story when he got the call to like go out there for like negotiations, he wasn't going to go to Paisley Park, but then he was like, you know what? I helped build this thing. So yeah, I'm going out there, and so, You know, and I'm sure at that point they probably were like, look, we're not doing it unless we do, you know, some songs, because we have a resume now where like we don't have to do your songs.
Yeah.
And so and so, you know, he kind of had to, you know, kind of meet him halfway. I do understand why he probably gave them, you know, those 5 songs, just because it was on Paisley Park. You know, always bet on yourself. You know, I'm sure that probably was part of like the negotiations, like I do 5, y'all do 5 type deal. I'm sure they maybe have, I mean, you know, he may have put up the money, you know, in terms of that. So he probably got to choose the singles, whereas they were probably like, you know, yeah, we did our 5 and we'll do our part about, you know, doing the videos and the, you know, promos and all of that. I don't know, but yeah, he kind of had to respect them at that point. Like, yeah, like 89, like 88, 89, you know, they could have easily said no and been all right with that. So, you know, for it to work, he had to kind of recognize and give them their credit that they had, you know, built up a good resume to where he had to recognize that.
Yes, I think when you have a track, when you have a track record like that, and I mean, well, so yeah, if we think about it in the terms of, you know, in the genesis, I'm bringing you in on this, you know, so you don't know how any of this works, and then, you know, almost a decade later, you've had multi-platinum success for some of these folks. You've dealt with the lawyers, you know how publishing works. Yeah, it's going to be some meetings, and some of them might be tense, but you get it done. You know, you fight it out. And I think one of the things that's the most interesting for me about, I always think about this when I think of Pandemonium, is I always think about in terms of, like, for me, at least for me, it was the first time that I got to see a little bit of the man behind the curtain, you know, like the Wizard of Oz. So like, I wasn't, as a 11-year-old, 12-year-old, I wasn't hip to like, oh, it's really just Prince doing this and da 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 da. And then, you know, you get to a certain age, like, oh, this is what we're doing, and this is how it works. And then again, you know, when you bring some people in, and then, you know, they get a modicum of success, and then, like you said, okay, now we're peers. So yeah. I've always thought of that as fascinating. So, yeah.
Okay, anything to add there, Zach?
I think it's just like Ricky and Ivan said. It's, you know, the Time had a lot more chips on their side of the table in 1990 than they did in 81. So, you know, I think that they were able. There was no way that Prince would have used them as a puppet band, you know, the way he did early on.
It was not going to happen. Not going to happen.
Okay. So we've got about 30 minutes here. I wanted to talk. I don't know if we have time to go through each song, but I did want to talk overall about some of the songs that you guys like and ones that you want to highlight deserve more shine. I did think it was interesting as I was reading through some of the credits. They had like Karen White was on the album.
Yep.
Early in the morning, I put breakfast on your table.
Yep. During the courtship, right? Yeah. That was the Terry Lewis courtship period, wasn't it?
Yeah. But I thought that was really
romantic.
So what are some of the songs that you feel need more shine, that you want to campaign for right now for the folks in the audience who may not have checked out this album? And we'll start with Ivan.
I'm on, and I'm going to tell you, I'll give all credit where credit is due, because the person that put me onto Databank is D'Angelo. so I'm just this. So I want you, you know, if I had a track from here, now I have my favorite, but if I had a track from this set that I would recommend to check out, that would be, you know, the one. And there's a number of reasons, but I think one of the things about it, again, you know, we talked about the outset about, you know, this is an album that, you know, a lot of folks don't necessarily revisit. But I think with Databank, I feel like that's one that holds, you know, it holds up. It's not too 1990-ish, I would say. So that's me. So. Yeah.
All right. What's up, Zach?
I mean, I hate to go. I feel like I already played all my cards with Jerk Out and Chocolate. Those are the top. Those are the top two for sure.
Yeah.
I think the one that made me think the most, I was the most kind of interested in just listening to, was Blondie. It's such an odd track. It's like, the time were always, they were a band that, they could rock. Like Jesse Johnson was and I've seen some people in the chat have been saying, talk about Jesse Johnson's guitar playing. So I'm talking about that now.
Yeah.
The time were a great rock band, but they never did a rock track, in the sense that Blondie is just, it's a rock track. And it reminds me, it feels like from the same lineage as, like, I'm thinking Dirty Diana by Michael Jackson, even like Sophisticated Bitch by Public Enemy, these songs with really heavy guitar leads. Sophisticated Bitch was incidentally by Vernon Reid, who we all know from this conference, that are, basically vehicles for misogynistic lyrics. That's the other part of it. It also makes me think about, you can trace that back to Prince with Bambi. It's like it's coming from that Bambi lineage, but in 1990. Really interesting song. So that's the one that kind of comes to mind.
Yeah, like I knew when I heard that in Skillet, I was like, yeah, Jesse had to bring these to the table.
Yeah, right.
No question in my mind that he brought those to the table.
Rick, what's your go-to?
I have two, actually, if you don't mind. The first one is Pandemonium. I like the title song. And I think the thing that sticks out to me is that they make a reference to a Sly and the Family Stone title where there's a riot going on in the title song, and then later in the movie you hear him chanting, "There's a riot going on." And then I think later, we find out that I think Jesse, Prince, and Jam and Lewis were big fans of that album. Like that was a big thing for their age group coming up. So that was kind of a nod to Sly. The other tune I like, of course, like My Summertime Thing. That joint is and it's, it's funny because when I read Dwayne like $2 book and, Prince's response, like, yeah, this song is weak.
Yes.
And then it's like, weak? You put elephants and flowers on Graffiti Bridge and you calling this weak? It's like, man. And then you find out that it's like rehearsal footage of him jamming to the very same song. And it's like, so that one really stands up now. I mean, so every version I hear, that one stands up. And then it got like new life, I think, when D'Angelo and Questlove, like, we did it for one of their festivals and they were playing it. And that's like a song that, people, like, you gotta be in the Purple People Kingdom type deal, to catch that one. Like, they started playing that, like, oh yeah, like I know that song. But those are the two that kind of stand out to me the most.
I think I might have heard that it was Jimmy Jam and or Terry Lewis who pushed for My Summertime Thing to be the I feel like I remember, because he struggled with that song for almost a decade. They were working on that, like Ice Cream Castle. Obviously on Graffiti Bridge we have The Latest Fashion, which is basically like a remix of my Summertime Thing. Prince, now that was one of those that he just, like, for whatever reason, to him at least, he couldn't nail it. And so I think it was Jimmy Jam liked that song and advocated for it. Which may be why we got both it and The Latest Fashion. Very odd decision, but also kind of points the way to, like the Diamonds and Pearls era remixes where, there's cream, but then there's also Gangsta Glam. So
yeah. Darling Nisi, what's your favorite?
Oh, am I back? Okay, so randomly, I thought this is gonna get me shot. Maybe I shouldn't say that. But Donald Trump Black version was really interesting to me because I saw the title before I heard the song, and I was expecting it to be like a funk jam or something, and it came out to be like a ballad. I was like, what's this? But I like it because it's so random like that, and I like things that are just things that I don't expect. So I really, really like that one. And then, I think I'm gonna just say that one, and then let people judge me.
I want to talk about Donald Trump Black version because, for one thing, I don't know how many people here know today is actually Mr. Trump's birthday. So I feel it's our duty as Americans to. But I think also I'm fascinated by this song for so many reasons. I mean, it's probably aged more. It's aged worse than any other, for obvious reasons, than any other song in the Prince. The wider Prince of it's so crazy, in 2020 that there's a Prince song called Donald Trump Black version. And I'm fascinated by the fact that, this is a corporate world track. And this was, Morris talks about it. It was kind of like, it was like a conceptual centerpiece of corporate world. He wrote in his autobiography, I have in my notes here, Trump was the avatar of the age. He was famous for his sexual exploits, the media magnet playboy, fucking gorgeous models, the man who had perfected the art of the deal and used any means necessary not to realize social justice, but to make himself filthy rich. He says the Black version of Trump doesn't use brain, heart, or even swag to get the girls. He gets them because they can't resist the color green. So, I mean, obviously, Trump was not a political figure per se in 1990, but I do think it's interesting that, the New York Times ad that he took out about the Central Park Five was 1989. But what I'm wondering is, how much was that in the news outside of, was that something that Prince as a non-New Yorker would not have noticed? Maybe he read about Trump and saw him on his plane in Vogue or whatever, or Vanity Fair, but didn't know about this whole side of Trump because, it's just fascinating. I can't imagine Prince would have been neutral on the issue of Donald Trump after the Central Park Five.
Yeah, I would say, I can't speak for him, but I would say at that time, we weren't as news heavy as a society as we are now, meaning ads that are taken out of every city now, you can almost see it because it's going to be on social media. Back then, unless you're unless you're there at the city at the time or in that location or someone just shows you, you could miss it. I think a lot of people, didn't catch that ad real time outside of New York. When I mean like outside of New York, at least 8 hours away, 8+ hours away.
Right.
Yeah.
You may have missed that ad, until later, say you found out. So that's very likely. And then too, say, he, was still at that time, he was what, 30, 31. So he was still like a young dude, kind of doing young dude stuff.
Right. Plus, plus if you think about 1990 and what that actually means when you talk about the iconography of Trump and how probably more than likely when in the corporate world sessions and as we get to this time, his ascendance in the zeitgeist is right along with Mike Tyson, right? So there's the fight, the plaza, the person, and then of course the success of Tyson at the particular time and maybe what that. Man, I mean, it's a very, I'm glad you brought this up. It's a very interesting social type of question to deal with, and again, the fact that, this is pre-internet. So we're really at the, we're really just so heavily influenced by media cuts and what their narrative is. So, yeah.
It was crazy hearing it on the Quiet Storm at night, riding home at night.
Like, man, I imagine that's a mood killer. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like, what is
It was
this?
not on
Even in
slow jam
1990.
tapes. It was not on slow jam tapes. I tell you that. It was not on slow jam tapes.
I mean, the
was
topic
not
of
on
the
the slow-
song, someone to pay for you and take care of you. Like,
Right.
Yeah, it was not on the slow jam playlist. It was not.
but yeah, I really, I will have to say that it's my favorite Time album. I'm sure that's a little blasphemous too, but I don't know if it's because it's different to look back on the songs, and you don't have all the nostalgia connects of the time, and so you just kind of consider it where you are as you experience it. But like the first couple of songs and how they flow together, and it's just flowing. It's just a jam for the first couple. I just really recommend people try this album out if you haven't. But so we've talked about the songs that you really like, and so what are the songs that don't quite work for you and why? And then hopefully you guys will fight now.
We've been too nice so far. Yeah.
Let's see. Songs that I don't particularly like. I wouldn't say it's songs that I don't like. Being a Prince fan, I've come to expect that the release you get, there's always something on the table.
Oh, you froze. We'll come back to Rick. Oh no.
It's because we mentioned Trump. Okay, let's see.
Yeah.
Secret Service.
Oh, he's back.
Sorry. No, I was just saying that I've always wondered what songs didn't make the cut, and you know, if there are any, because I'm sure there are some, you know, and so with that, you know, it's always, you know, I mean, now especially, you know, with the deluxe releases of things, you're finding out, oh, this was from that time period. I mean, you could have swapped this out for that. So, you know, it just kind of makes me wonder, like, so you know, like what else did Jesse or Jam and Lewis or Monty or Jelly Bean have that just didn't make the cut that they could have used, or that they, you know, may have submitted that just didn't get the votes? And so that's pretty much my take on that. I don't have a least favorite tune on it.
Okay, that's fair. Anybody else?
I will say, and I realize again, I've been kind of following along with the chat, and there were, you know, it has its fans. And Morris actually said that this was a highlight, you know, but I am just not, just categorically not big on the Times ballads. Sometimes I get lonely. It's fine, but it just doesn't feel like that's not what I'm coming to the Time for. And I feel like, especially when it's so similar in, you know, in theme, I guess, to Gigolos Get Lonely Too. Yeah. Like that's the only Time ballad I need is Gigolos Get Lonely.
Oh, you know what? Okay, well, let me ask you this. Out of it, they've only had 4 really solid ballads. Girl, Oh Baby, like Gigolos, and then this one. So, like, you know, would you rank this one your least favorite of their 4 ballads, or would you?
Honestly, it might be because I really don't like the ones from the first album. Because I think that the first album was before Morris learned how to sing, basically. Like, if we're gonna be really real about it. So I would actually say that this is number 2, but it's a distant number. Like, it's Gigolos and then everything else for me.
Okay.
Yeah, it was interesting. Mine is I'll give it to you like this. I didn't like it at the time, but then later on in life. So at the time, I did not like Chocolate. And I think because of my age, and I was just like, I'm just on to the new. I mean, you know, it's great, it's funky, but for me, I think it was just, there were just musical elements that a 1990 me was like, nah, I'm on to the other stuff. But now I love it, you know, 30 years later, it's like, oh, it's great. This is what I want to hear. But yeah.
Yeah, I just had a note about Chocolate. A couple of weeks ago when Betty Wright died, whenever someone big in the Black world dies, I check to see if Prince ever covered their music. And so I was looking through my little records, and somebody said that Prince had covered Betty Wright during the New Tour. And I was like, I don't know. And I checked the song that they noted, and it was a ZC Hill Don't Make Me Pay for His Mistakes cover.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually sent it to Scott Woods because I know he's a big blues guy. I was like, do you hear Betty Wright in this? Because I don't, because I've listened to it 3 or 4 times and I don't hear it. And he didn't either. And it was interesting because Rosie Gaines sings it in like a female. Just knows ZZ Hill is a dude.
Mm-hmm.
And Prince will come in and say the lyrics of Chocolate during that before he goes into the
So he don't say that
dialogue. And I thought that was really interesting in how he incorporated.
Okay, now he don't say
I
that.
wrote this in case you didn't know.
Okay, he don't say the mashed potatoes, green beans, chitlins, and cranberry.
Oh, he's talking about shrimp. He was like that shrimps.
Oh, yeah.
He talks about the shrimp. He puts that in there.
18 jumbo shrimp.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got about 15 minutes here before we get to the questions. So I'm going to go ahead and ask some of my closing questions for you guys. How does the Pandemonium compare with the other Times albums for you? When it's, the rankings. And we can start with Zach.
Yeah, so I think we were kind of talking about this before we came on stage. I'm like definitely What Time Is It is at the top for me. And then maybe half of the time, I think it's interesting. Their first album, half of it is, I think, the strongest Time album. Half of it is by far the weakest for me, at least. It's pretty much directly like right down the middle. And then it's honestly, it's hard to say between. I feel like both Ice Cream Castle and Pandemonium have high highs and low lows. They're both really, I think, fascinating albums that maybe don't quite hang together as like track after track classics the way that What Time Is It does. But today I will say Pandemonium gets the edge over Ice Cream Castle. So.
Okay, Ivan.
Yeah. So are we counting 4 or 5? No, because the other thing. No.
Oh, good question.
Yeah.
Good question.
I know.
Okay, pulling Zachary off the stage. So I'm going to jump in. I'm going to jump out. All right, I agree with you, Zachary. I love What Time Is It? I think it's a classic. I mean, 777-9311 alone is worth that being the best Time album. However, my number 2 is Pandemonium. And in fact, I actually play Pandemonium more than I play What Time Is It? When I play What Time Is It, I usually play specific songs, like One Day I'm Gonna Be Somebody, or 777-9311. But when I play Pandemonium, I play it all the way through.
Wow.
Now I might go to the bathroom during Donald Trump. But I love that record, and I'm out.
All right.
Hey, D'Angelo.
Funny.
Okay, go ahead, Ivan.
Yeah, well, mine is just it's very similar. I would rank it 3, which is for me it's a place of honor. So I mean it's not bad, but it's just something about the time. What time is it's just so ingrained in my being when I think about that band that it's really after that it gets very difficult, but it's still a place of honor at ranking at 3 in the 4. So yeah.
Okay, Ricky.
That's an unfair question because my ears were different in 81 to 84 than they were in 90. Mm-hmm. But I think in terms of consistency, I know What Time Is It flows better, because you got Wild and Loose, 777, One Day I'm Gonna Be Rich, The Walk, and then Gigolos, and then I Don't Want to Be Lonely. It's kind of the strongest of the first 3. The Ice Cream Castles, outside of Ice Cream Castles, My Draws, The Bird, and Jungle Love, I mean, that's pretty much it. My Draws really didn't get a lot of play. So I would go with maybe What Time Is It? And then Pandemonium. Pandemonium, I know to me is special because I was just so happy to see them come back together. And I was happy to see them just say, you know, they came back together, and we had been waiting for that, and they had been talking about it, and it was just good to see them go off, grow, and then come back, and then give us something that, you know, some stuff that they had done. And I think, you know, I think where we come up short in it is that we don't know how much time they actually had to do Pandemonium, because, you know, like I said, Prince did 5 songs, they did 4 or 5, so it's kind of like, you know, we don't know if they were rushed, or, you know, maybe if at that time they had the amount of time that they would have had on, like, you know, like Jesse's projects or Janet's stuff, what could they have come up with? That would have been interesting to see. But yeah, I think, you know, for those 2 purposes, you know, like, what time is it? That was just at a point in my life where I mean, like Ivan said, it just became such a part of my DNA that, you know, that's just a go-to. And then, like, Pandemonium is probably a strong second.
Okay.
That.
We were all different. No.
I'm just thinking about the time in Morris, especially because, again, as someone who witnessed all this and had to go back and listen and see, I think I was doing some thread. I did a thread on the time on my Darling Nisi Twitter, like, last year or something, because I was watching the documentary they did, which is really good. You should try to get your hands on that. But as I was tweet watching it, it reminded me of Morris being an actor. Mm-hmm. And I saw that episode of 2T7 that he was on. He was a Prince, and they kept calling him Prince. I was just like, what is happening? And then there was another show where he was like a hairdresser.
Yeah, new attitude.
A new attitude. And there's 4 or 5 episodes. You can see them on YouTube, and they're really good. I'm like, he could have done really well as an actor, and it's just a shame that it didn't really pan out for him.
Yeah.
But I'm going to ask his final divisive question, though. I think everybody's going to agree. Graffiti Bridge or Pandemonium? And we'll start with Ricky.
You go put me on the spot. What, in terms of albums?
If you had to pick, which one wins?
Are you really waiting on this question?
I mean, Graffiti Bridge does have, like, Joy and Repetition and, like, The Question to You on it, but it does have that other song, like, that I don't like on it. You know what? Because I'm a band guy, I'm gonna go with the fellas. I'm gonna go with Pandemonium because I'm a band dude, and so yeah, I'm going.
Okay, Zach, how about you?
I mean, I'm on thin enough ice with D'Angelo already, but it's not the only reason why I'm saying this, though, because I do think Graffiti Bridge, obviously, you know, I think has higher highs, namely Joy and Repetition, you know, among others, but it also has lower lows, and Pandemonium, I think, to D'Angelo's point, this is an album that you could just put on. And it, you know, at the worst it's going to be is fine. You know, like it's a solid album. And Graffiti Bridge is a little more complicated than that. So yeah, I think if I'm choosing to listen to Graffiti Bridge or Pandemonium, it's probably going to be Pandemonium.
Okay, Ivan.
Yeah, I think now we're all united because I mean, and for me, a lot of it does really boil down to the real-time nostalgia of just having this group back that means so much and meant so much. And Graffiti Bridge for me is like, yeah, again, it's like highs and it's lows, and there's some things that I'm like, you know, I do have a visceral reaction to. So, and I mean, not, you know, it's not like super negative, but it's just like, I don't know, because I have very high standards for, you know, the output of this wonderful artist. So yeah, I think for me, yeah, Pandemonium makes me think of Summer '90, and I like that a lot. So yeah,
that's fair. Okay, so now we have time for questions from the audience, even though we've been reading what you've been saying so far.
I can't see anything.
Go ahead and put them in, and we'll get them answered by our panelists.
I think one thing that came up way back in the beginning is someone wanted to talk specifically about Jesse's guitar playing on Pandemonium.
Man, let me tell you something. Boy, Jesse is an underrated gunslinger. Jesse is an underrated gunslinger. That dude, you know, like when you listen to Skillet and Blondie, just if you could take the vocals out alone, you would hear him doing some stuff. Even on Sometimes I Get Lonely, you know, he's kind of, you know, killing it on the ballad. So yeah, he was, but you know, like those of us who had been following Jesse, like that was nothing new. We, you know, like we knew Jesse could kind of get down like that. So, you know, because right after that, he did Bare My Naked Soul. So, you know, he was slowly transitioning.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything to add to that. Jesse's great. He's an amazing guitarist. So it's cool. And, you know, it's cool to see him get to do it on a Time album. I mean, obviously he played the solo on Jungle Love, and you know, The Bird was live, and so that was actually him. But for a lot of the time, it was Prince doing a Jesse Johnson impression on those early albums, and so now, you know, we get to hear him actually do it.
You know, what's funny is he always says that when he first brought them songs, they would laugh at his songs. And then when he brought them like Jungle Love, he was like, yeah, okay, the laughing stopped. And then, right. you know, funny how he wrote their two biggest hits. And then when he came to Pandemonium, he went back to his roots with him. Like, I'm gonna give you some, you know, rock guitar stuff. So yeah, so that's you know, I always thought that was interesting.
Okay, so I saw a couple more. We talked about this backstage, but what do you think of the album cover?
That's a loaded question.
Well, if there was one thing, if it had to be one miss,
right?
You know what? I will say this: when you look at their first three album covers, front and the back, they look really like cool and, you know, wall worthy to hang on and stuff like that. And then when you see this one, you're just kind of like, that's not what I was expecting. And then when you know, like when you saw like, I know like the promotional posters, you know, it was like, say, Return of like the Magnificent Seven. It was this, and then it was kind of like, okay, you know, I think Zachary said like, who was the, you know, you know, like who copied and pasted this together? Like, you know,
they want a deadline, Rick.
Yeah. Yeah, let's take this picture, fellas. Come on.
Polaroid.
Yeah, like that was the only part of it. I was just kind of like, oh, this cover.
I get what they're going for, because Skillet, right? But I've always wondered, was Skillet, was it the concept first or the cover, and then they wrote the song Skillet about their experience being in a giant skillet? It's a very strange choice.
Yeah, you know, and you know, speaking of Skillet, like that was another thing, like that was kind of it was a skit, but it was a joke and cultural reference, because they was like, you know, like, we don't need no microwave, you know, whereas on the What Time Is It album, so we don't like new wave, and you know, that term, like, we don't need, okay, like no microwave was like a dig at, you know, something being hot for 1 minute and then fizzling out. And so, you know, them cooking on the skillet was like, yo, like we, you know, like we really do this, like we can get down with it. And so, you know, we could, you know, 1990 alone had a lot of microwave artists like Gerardo, Rico Suave, and
what?
You know, like some other people, you're like, what? Snap. You know, it's like, you know, like they had a big hit and they came and went. So I always thought that was, you know, like that reference of cooking on a skillet, you know, in terms of music was like, you know, like they're doing, you know, like cooking up a groove. I thought that was like really dope.
And there's that part at the beginning too, where he yanks off the, like, you know, the fake like house record basically that's playing in Pandemonium, and he's like, "I'll put this on," and you know, it's the track Pandemonium. So it is like they're making a point about the kind of like organicness of the time, even though this is the sort of New Jack Swing era time, so not as organic as they used to be. But
yeah.
And you know, I was trying to find this quote. It's from from an article from September of '90 with members of the time. Dennis Hunt, Los Angeles, is from the Los Angeles Times, and it was Jimmy Jam talking about how they intended to have the record sound like it just picked up where they left off, and where they didn't really want to put too many elements or identifiers of New Jack and other things. And he said, one critic said it sounded like the album was made in '85, and he actually took that as a compliment. So, which is interesting to say the least. But, yeah,
that's what I was going. And I do remember this at this time. I think, if I'm not mistaken, when this was done, and after Graffiti Bridge came out, that's when Prince opened up his first Glam Slam in like Minneapolis or something. And MTV did a little, news thing, and they were talking to Jimmy Jam, and they were like, so what do you think? He was like, oh, it's cool. Like, Prince is go play here. The Time might come do some stuff. And I remember thinking like, wow, like Glam Slam is gonna be hot. This is gonna be a fire spot, man. They gonna have the Time and Prince playing there. And never got to make it up there, but yeah,
So I'm jumping in because I see a comment by Tammy, and I was going to jump in when you guys were. I'm sorry, I can't help myself. I love this album so much, and Tammy, I love the skits. And the one that Tammy wrote in the chat is the one. Give me a little bit of that pepper. Give me a little bit of that.
Kill it and cook it.
Yeah.
On that stove.
So, like, for me, the album cover, while it's cheesy, I love it. I loved all the singles covers. I don't know if you guys remember the single covers. Yes, it's cheesy, but there's good cheese.
Sure.
Yeah.
Just embrace it, but it's fun.
I mean, the music more than makes up for it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, definitely. So, I like that they had a concept. And we were cooking through the whole.
It's a concept. Yeah, that's for sure.
Maybe because I'm from the South and I know about cast iron skillets.
Hey.
Iron skillet, yeah, boy.
Yeah.
So, I don't know.
You remember this? I don't know about that, JB.
Exactly.
And man, we can't forget about the end with Kansas City. Like the car breaks down.
I have a question about Yount. Now, is this like a Princeism, or is this like slang that was going on at the time?
Knowing those guys, it probably was some slang. I mean, they had.
It feels like friends goofing around to me.
Yeah.
It feels very like insular inside joke. I mean, I don't know. Like I was 6 years old and growing up in an all white town in Michigan. So I'm not the guy to ask about Yount. But,
Now in the South, Rick,
Nah, that was some time stuff. That was just, like that was them. I say,
And Neil said they were trying to make Yount happen. I think that's the best. That's the best way to put it.
I mean, I know Robin Yount played shortstop, but I mean, I was saying,
like that.
I don't know.
That was just.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
The Dawn Experience had a question, and I know we kind of briefly overlooked it, probably for a reason, but what were your opinions of the Condensate album that came later?
Oh, Rick? No, I'm just I'll go. Hey, Rick. No, I really like that album. I mean, I feel like I guess they were kind of in a similar. 2011. I mean, man. Yeah, I liked it a lot. I played it quite a bit. And you could just, I guess it was a similar thing. That's why it's such a great question, because I feel like, man, here we are again, right? And it's like, and maybe we'll take a ride. Now we're, in the autumn or whatever. And I guess, it's like any great team. it's like when Jordan comes back after playing baseball. I mean, you can try, but what are you all's thoughts about it? I mean, I was probably vague, but I like it. So
I think it's a fun reunion album. I think it's sort of, there's, bands getting back together is rarely what it was when it's first, when there's been a long hiatus, especially when, we were kind of touching on this early on about how the political balance between Prince and the time changed so much in the between the early 80s and the end of the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the time was a band that was assembled. They were all kind of on the same level. Even Prince wasn't that famous when he put the time together. Mm-hmm. And then, for Jam and Lewis, there's a ton of baggage there. They're just, legends in their own right. Jesse has had his own career. I don't know if I think it can only really be like a one-off reunion album that's fun and that reminds you of what why you love the time in the first place. But it's not going to be the same as when they first came out.
Mm-hmm.
And I will also just say, whenever artists do a song that is like trying to tap into a current trend.
Oh, press send.
Or trending, hashtag trending. I don't know. That made me cringe a little bit, but they tried, and it sounded great. It sounded amazing.
Yeah. Well, initially I loved the DVD that came with it. I thought that was great that they, told their story, how they remember seeing it. I thought that was great. Musically, again, my ears were different than what they were in 1990 than, from what they were in 81. So I was listening a little different. I mean, it was more of a sentimental thing for me. I was just happy just to see them, like you said, Zach, kind of come back together and still doing something. Like I wasn't looking for it to be, chart topping and, blowing up the charts and, blowing up the airwaves. It could have just been, download only. I still would have got it. So, I was happy just to hear them still doing their thing. And I don't know what their intention was, if they were, planning on touring or doing those things. And it was good to see them do the TV circuit on some talk shows and stuff like that. And they did, a few things, and they had a video. But I think, I think the DVD, coming with it is what captured most people's attention, because for the first time they could tell they had a documentary, and so it probably could have been longer, but it was still good. And so it kind of gave gave them a chance to tell their story and whatnot. Of course, since then, you get stories from different, members about what they thought about this time period and whatnot. But I thought it was, like Zach, I thought it was a good comeback together project. So it was a surprise, because I think this was after they had done the Vegas residency. And so, it's kind of like, oh, okay, cool. Y'all still doing stuff. Wonderful. I'm always happy when, guys who like start out together can come back together and just kind of, bond and kick it and like reunite. That's always a good thing to see. Because we'll never see like Earth, Wind and Fire as the 9 like Earth, Wind and Fire. We'll never see like the Temptations as what they were. So, the fact that a band from my era that I could say was my era, can still like get together. And when they get together, it's some magic to like whenever all, 6 or 7 of them are there, they, they do their thing. So.
Yeah, I know we keep saying the DVD, but the DVD is important, because that's what I appreciate when you're talking about anything. It's, of course, all this is about Prince, kind of. But when they talk about the community centers that they grew up with, the mentorship that is just now starting to come back again, that Prince was created out of a community that did similar things, and they all supported each other. And that came back out in 2011. It's worth looking at to get that context, and because it's really important. And then also there's shade at Prince. Kind of funny. So Another question that came up from Liam Barry, I hope I said that right. What does the panel think of where the time are these days? Have they become a parody of themselves?
I mean, honestly, this is something that we didn't bring up because we didn't do the track by track thing. But part of me, this is kind of, they're already sort of a parody at this point. I was listening to Morris, and like, obviously Morris was always, the whole point of Morris Day is he's larger than life. But there are parts of this album where he's almost channeling like Randy Watson in Sexual Chocolate. You know, he's just like, it's Morris on 11, and so, you know, I think there's always been a component of self-parody with the time, and I mean, maybe now just the fact that they don't have the new material coming in, and they've really, you know, they're a nostalgia act now, and I mean that totally changes. That maybe tips the scales toward self-parody, because all they could do now is, you know, the bird and the stuff that we know, the walk, you know, there's no longer like a vital creative motor behind them. But that happens to almost, you know, that happens to almost every band.
Yeah.
Eventually.
I think, you know, well, for one, they're older. That's just, you know, like they're like 62 plus, you know, but, you know, I think Jimmy Jam said it best was that, you know, like Prince was the architect, and then they executed what he gave them. And then they executed, you know, the best of any other projects coming out of the camp. And so I think, you know, one thing about Pandemonium, like where they were in terms of where they were like when they started, was that, you know, they had a little bit more money in their pocket come Pandemonium. They had a little bit more money in their pocket come, you know, Condensate. So, you know, kind of like Zach said, you know, at this point, it's kind of like, you know, I don't think anyone is really pressed to hear them do new stuff. I mean, I think people would appreciate it, but like you said, like when we go see them, you have in your mind, I'm going to hear songs from, you know, like The Time to, you know, I mean, like Pandemonium. And so, you know, I think anybody that goes to see them, those six, you know, and then I think no offense to, you know, Tory Ruffin and Freeze and all those guys, because they've done a good job, you know, like with Morris touring. But I think if you see them, either way you see them, whether it's the original 7 or it's, you know, Morris and The Time, you know, like you will be impressed on how they, you know, like do the material and how they execute it. Because they are a band, and so they have, you know, that old school way of kind of doing things. And, you know, like when they get to the stage, it's like take no prisoners. So, you know, I think that when you say a parody, like we know what to expect. Like when we see them, it's, you know, gonna be some silliness. You know, Morris is gonna say something totally left field. They're gonna do this, and then you're like, okay, like we've come to expect that. So if we didn't see that, then we would think something was wrong. So I know I would.
That would be interesting if by some miracle they were able to come together, and it would be a time kind of, this is me dreaming, like a time music festival where they could do time songs and Jesse could do his songs. Like everybody could do their own songs, because it's all the Minneapolis sound, as it were. And then, I mean, they all were successful in their own rights. Because I know, I mean, admittedly, I haven't been a huge Jesse Johnson fan. But when I saw him at Celebration and he talked about his story, and then he got up there and played his songs, I was like, I've been missing out a lot. Let me go back and listen to this. It's stuff. It's music. And I know sometimes it always gets antsy, and people are like, well, just because, you know, they played with Prince doesn't mean we have to support them. But he saw something in all these artists that he could do something with and bring into his fold, and sometimes take the work of. But that's important. So if you kind of like, if you like the style of music that Prince does and produces and brings into his, you know, musical world, the others are worth checking out too.
Absolutely.
I mean, you know, like I said on a few podcasts, I mean, you know, there were, over the course of his career, Prince would, doing his live shows, give them little snippets of shout outs. Like, you know, doing a nude tour, they did the little, like, what have you done for me lately? He was like, hey, did I write that? You know, on the Sign of the Times tour, he did parts of Jesse Johnson's She I Can't Resist live. where they would play. So he knew, you know, that they were doing some stuff, and so, you know, it would be good to see him again. But, you know, I understand now as an adult that, you know, sometimes, you know, like you grow with certain people to a certain point, and then you have to go your separate ways. And, you know, I'm sure at some point, you know, hopefully they'll all come back, you know, and tell us some stories. They'll be a little bit more grayer. And,
Yeah.
you know,
That's part of my part of the DVD. When they're just sitting around talking, like, remember that one time? Like, blah, blah, blah. I just want to listen.
Yeah. That's
Okay.
that.
Still looking for some questions here. Well, I have one. We'll see if this will be the last one. So we know what happens when a project becomes a group effort. Do you think that the talent and skill was there for the earlier records to be a group effort in the way that Pandemonium was?
That's a great question.
I would say not as much. And I said it to say because even though Jam and Lewis were doing some production during the What Time Is It era for Climax and stuff like that, those songs weren't, you know, kind of like hits or, you know, songs that people like remember. Like you have to kind of like research those. But then when they started having hits for different people and not sounding the same, that, you know, your songwriting gets a little better. I think with, you know, like if you listen to their production on Janet's Control compared to like Sherelle's What Have You Done For Me Late, I mean, you know, like, I mean, I Didn't Mean to Turn You On, it's completely different. It sounds like, whoa, this was just like 2 years ago or like a year ago. I think with Jesse, like when you hear his first album and then you hear his second album, it's like growth. And so I think, you know, I'm sure they would probably argue, but like we had it there, but then like Jesse has even said, you know, in a couple of interviews that, you know, he kind of stayed up under Prince because he was trying to learn how to make records. Prince knew how to make hit records. And so I think, you know, once they kind of got that, you know, it does take, you know, like the bird to fly off on their own to kind of see how strong your wings are. And so once they got that, then they were able to do it. And I think that's why, you know, Prince, you know, was like controlling, like when people say that, I mean, say, you know, you got to put yourself in his shoes. He was on the line for that stuff, you know, like when nobody checking for vanity and then if the record didn't sell well, you know, when nobody knocking on her door like, hey, look, your album didn't sell, you know, like they were looking at him. And so he had to, you know, like bet on himself and make sure it worked. And he had the track record for writing hits. So,
but yeah. No, I'm not to cut in, Rick, but you said something that just resonated so much because you said two things. Okay, you said a bunch of stuff, but songs, right? Like songs and hit songs. And the thing is, and this is something, and not to go off on a tangent, but this is something that frustrates me a lot of times in the era that we are in now, where you have people who can really play, like they're great. And like I would say, like the guys in the time, they were like very super proficient musicians. But that doesn't always translate into being able to, one, write a song, and two, write a hit song. And so I think, that whole nurturing Prince being, this is my name on the line, but I have a track record. I've got this thing down. And I think that is so vitally, I mean, I didn't understand it when I was young, but I understand it now because it's a very different skill set than being able to play, it's a keyboard in front of me, but being able to play all these keys fast or whatever. So, that's my take on it. So,
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I and this is kind of the eternal question about the Prince proteges. Like, if he had loosened his grip a little bit, would it have been different? I mean, it would have been different. Would it have been better? I think it was Arthur way at the beginning of this. I think in the chat he was saying, like, imagine if he had not fallen out with Jam and Lewis and let them be house producers at Paisley Park. And so I think there always is, like, if he had just kind of broadened his if he'd let people in a little bit more, it might have been a disaster, but it might have been better. At the same time, it is like when you're Prince and you can play everything and you can write great songs, even that first Time album. Here's my chance to redeem myself. When I say half of the first Time album is the best Time album, I mean, it's Get It Up. It's cool. I mean, they're already some of their best songs are on that album. So when you're Prince, you don't need to let the band write the songs. You have the songs. It's like, just shut up and play the songs that I wrote for you. Like I can totally understand that. But maybe if he just loosened his grip a little bit, maybe if he let Jesse get credit for Jungle Love, or let them play their own instruments on the albums or something, we could have been looking at a trajectory that the band didn't fizzle out so quickly.
Because like a lot of people don't realize, Jesse on his albums and his protege albums, he like that's all him playing. He did all that stuff. So they like, I know they clearly had it, but then it makes you wonder, well, did you have it in 81, 82? Not in 85, 86. So now we'll never know, but I'm sure that situation forced them to grow, so they got better with that.
Okay. I don't want D'Angelo to pop in and Sandman me. So we got about 8 minutes left. Trying to see if there are any other questions, but thank you guys so much for joining us today for this Pandemonium panel. Again, we have Mr. Zachary Hoskins. Or can you guys say where you can be found online so people can follow you?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me on princesongs.org. I'm also I've been much more active on Twitter this weekend than I usually am. So expect the pace to slow down, but you can find me on Twitter at DMSRblog.
Oh, good.
Rick.
I am. You can find me on Facebook, Ricky Wyatt. Instagram, Footprints Cubase 4, and Twitter, Footprints Groove. I'll be doing some grown folk stuff, and I'm sure D'Angelo will be pulling me in to do some stuff. And I will frequent Zach's sites now and then harass him with some stuff.
I love it.
Yes, please harass.
Now that I have his stuff, I will.
That's cool.
I do podcasts with Kanisa. It's literally just her yelling at me about my bad opinions.
It's the whole time. Yeah,
that's funny.
Oh man. So let me ask this question. I'm sure this is kind of like a no-brainer, but let me just ask anyway. So will the Time go down as Prince's strongest protege project?
Well, we're thinking, Ivan, leave your details.
Oh, yeah. You can find me at grownfolksmusic.com, writing, ranting, and of course the podcast we do are housed there, as well as all my socials have the at IORR03. So I'm pretty easy to find. So thanks.
Does anybody have their controversial answer?
I do. I actually don't see the Time as a protege. I really do see it as a collaboration between Prince and Morris. So when I think of the Time, I don't think of them as proteges. That's my answer, and I'm sticking with it.
That speaks to the fact that they're the best. That they've kind of transcended being considered proteges. I think the only other group or artist that I would say is less of a protege act is Sheila E. And that's only because she was already, a world-class musician before Prince decided to make her into a pop star. But yeah, the Time is almost, they have their own, it's not the level of Prince, but they're a significant group in their own. They're one of the most significant, definitely funk bands of the 80s.
Yeah.
And I mean, just following up on what you just said, Zach, I also don't think of Sheila E. as a protege either. because of I have all of her albums that she recorded with her father. Happy Together is one of my favorite ones. Pete and Sheila Escovedo. And she, I mean, you can say whatever you want about Sheila the person, but you can't say about Sheila the musician. She is incredible.
Oh, yeah. Hell of a musician.
And like I remember seeing Purple Rain. It was the opening act of Sheila E. with those neon drumsticks. That is what I remember. Like that was what blew my mind, along with Prince coming out of the floor with all the smoke. But those drumsticks, that was amazing. It was incredible. Like I felt that Sheila E. was Prince's peer in like when she came out. Like I was like, okay, now we got somebody who can like toe to toe with Prince. And I mean, a lot of times when they would perform, you could just see the connection and the love. I'm talking about in terms of musicianship. Like, again, I'm just talking about musicianship. So like, there's this one clip that gets shown a lot where Prince is playing the congas, and Sheila's on the timbales, and they're just having so much fun together. So I think that it was because Sheila was his peer. So I don't think of her as a protege either. So that's just me. So with that being said, I think that the strongest protege album, not necessarily act, is definitely Jill Jones.
I knew you were going to say that.
It's also the family, but it's actually it has a lot to do with Claire Fisher, because I'm like a Claire Fisher string person. And then also with the family, you got Eric Leeds, and I love Eric Leeds playing. I mean, I really do. It's so funny. I met Eric Leeds the first celebration in 2017. And I was like, oh my God, you're my favorite, horn player. And he was like, what's your second? And I was so like, I can't believe I'm talking to you that I could not come up with that one other one. And I thought, oh my God, he's going to think that I'm up, But it was just, I could not believe I am in the presence of Eric Leeds. What other horn players are there? It's just, so that's how I feel about the time and Sheila E. I really don't see them as proteges.
Okay.
I mean, it's interesting, all the people who came from the camp that were like musicians, like played an instrument, that they were never a slouch on their instrument. And even today, like when you check for them, they're still doing something, musically. Cause like St. Paul is no slouch on his bass, like when he plays, he is strong and say, shout out to those guys, Jerry Hubbard and Mark Harden, for filling in, because, like they were in an impossible spot, to kind of fill, Jam and Lewis and Monty's shoes, and then to come in and like Jesse's grilling them at rehearsals and, and stuff like that, that's kind of, but yeah, I think everybody that came in with some musical background, pretty much, strong on their instrument and they could do their thing.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for this. Darling Nisi, did you actually say about your social media presence?
Right.
Yeah. So I'm on Twitter at Darling Nisi, Instagram at Darling Nisi. I also have a podcast, Muse to the Pharaoh, where we talk about Prince from a women's perspective. And recently, specifically how to challenge you a little bit about some of your biases you might have. So we've done some about Dear White People, which is my most popular episode. We've done some about exploring Prince's legacy, his Black legacy across his career and the different decisions that he made based on coming from that culture. Done some controversial ones as well. I'm not going to talk about that because it's going to be on YouTube later. But check out my website, darlingnisi.com. And I'm also part of the Podcast Juice Network with Michael Dean as well. And you can see me over there on some of his stuff too.